In 1955, a 14-year-old African-American boy was murdered in Mississippi. His name was Emmett Till. He'd left his home in Chicago to visit relatives in the southern state, and his mother, Mamie Bradley, had worried for her boy's safety even before he'd left. She knew what the Jim Crow South could be like. Her fears were realized. During his stay, Till was accused of whistling at a white girl, and later 2 white men would kill him. Later still, they would be acquitted of all charges. Mamie Bradley was told the news on the phone. She arrived at the train station to receive her son's body. Before the train had left Mississippi, there had been strict orders that the casket was not to be opened. When it arrived, the undertaker pleaded with Mamie not to open the casket. He wanted to spare her the sight of her son's body. But Emmett's mother had already made up her mind. She ordered the casket open. Later, she would talk about how difficult it was to see what had been done to her son. And then she made a very important decision. The casket would remain open for the visitation and for the funeral. "Let the people see what they did to my boy," she said. In the days that followed, hundreds of thousands would come to the church to see. In the weeks that followed, millions more would see in magazines. Mamie Bradley's decision to open her son's casket marked a turning point in the racial struggle in the United States. The uproar that her son's death created catalyzed a generation of black leaders to end lynching and to level the racial hierarchy behind it. Reflecting on the moment, Bradley had this to say: "They had to see what I had seen. The whole nation had to bear witness to this. I knew that if they walked by that casket, if people opened up the pages of Jet magazine and the Chicago Defender, if other people could see it with their own eyes, then together we would find a way to express what we had seen." By refusing to keep her son's casket closed, she opened the nation up to the violence that had happened to her son and to the violence within it. Her decision and the activists inspired by that decision confronted their society with the truth about itself. Half a decade later, the great essayist James Baldwin explored the necessity of this moment of reckoning. He had this to say: "One cannot deny the humanity of another without diminishing one's own. In the face of one's victim, one sees oneself." I think it's a powerful insight. Only in seeing the consequences of our fantasies, only in looking on the faces of those we've hurt, can we see the truth about ourselves. Well, today we encounter another victim, another body. The image at the heart of the Christian faith, Christ crucified on the cross, is today placed squarely in front of our eyes. I've grown up listening to this story my whole life, and yet I still find that it makes me uncomfortable. I do think there's danger in dwelling on this image too much, and yet today we have to look. Now, the discomfort that we may feel while looking at Jesus on the cross, I think, is not specific just to readers of this story. It's an important element in the story itself. For the 2 other major characters in St. John's Gospel, Peter and Pilate, feel this pain also. Neither one can bear to be in Jesus' presence for very long. And I think their discomfort and our discomfort in hearing it comes from the same place. Earlier in the gospel, Jesus calls himself the way, the truth, and the life. And it's this truthfulness that makes being with Jesus so hard. Consider Peter. When he sees that Jesus is about to be taken away and arrested, he reaches for his sword. But Jesus rebukes him. Peter believed himself to be defending Jesus, and yet Jesus' rebuke shows that he was, in fact, defending himself from seeing Jesus as he truly is. When the world stopped matching his perception of it, he reached for his sword. His decision to resort to violence was a consequence of the failure of the world to match up with his perception of it. Later on, of course, Peter goes on to deny Jesus 3 times. He chooses a convenient fiction rather than the cost of the painful truth. And so his friend suffers out of his sight. The conversation with Pilate and Mark has the same dynamic at its heart. Up to this point in St. John's Gospel, Jesus is talkative, voluble even. He's always ready to argue and to teach. But when he comes before Pilate, he grows quiet. When he's asked about the charges that are brought against him, all he will say is that he has come into the world to bear witness to the truth. And Pilate is unsettled by this. Jesus' vulnerability, his refusal to defend himself, makes him anxious. Like Peter, he can't stand to be in Jesus' presence for very long, and so he sends him away. Once more, the gap between truth and fantasy is filled by violence. Jesus is taken away to be killed. This topic of the world confronting us with the truth about us is one that James Baldwin returns to over and over in his writing. In another essay, he writes these words: "Collision between one's image of oneself and what one actually is always painful." He goes on, "There are 2 things you can do about it. You can meet the collision head-on and try and become what you really are, or you can retreat and try to remain what you thought you were, which is a fantasy in which you will certainly perish." I think this is remarkably close to the message of St. John's Gospel. Our preference for fantasy is a kind of spiritual death. And it is from these fantasies, from this preference, that Jesus comes to rescue us. "You will know the truth, and the truth will make you free," he tells his followers. And yet here at the end of his life, we see the price of that freedom. Writing teachers are fond of telling their students to show, not tell. And so when Jesus comes to the end of his life, he doesn't have another lesson to teach. He becomes his message. He shows the world the truth that it cannot hear. His body there on the cross shows the truth about us and the truth about God. Well, there's a long history in Christian worship of putting the words of Christ's accusers into our mouths. Ordinary Good Friday reading, we would be responding. I think it's a way of enacting the recognition that we too are subject to the same preference for fantasy over the truth. We too are trapped in the networks of violence that result from our failure to face the truth. Emmett Till's death may feel far away, but George Floyd's does not. The awful delusion of white supremacy continues into the present day. The violence that results from our illusions, of course, may not be quite so catastrophic as those examples. But I think we all have victims, people who suffer for our refusal to see the truth about ourselves. In the face of one's victim, one sees oneself, Baldwin says. The cross, that great symbol of our faith, shows us the truth about ourselves. And I think the pain of looking at it is the pain of seeing the consequences of our failure to face the truth. And yet the cross also shows us the truth about God. Our fantasies about ourselves break against that image. So too our projections about what God must be like are confronted by that image. In the naked and lifeless form of Jesus, we see the character of God. God, out of love, chooses to become a victim, to suffer the consequences of our delusions in order that we might be free. Humankind cannot bear very much reality, the poet says. It's painful to look on the body of Jesus. It's a painful day. It's much easier to occupy our minds with other subjects or to try to pin the blame on someone else. And yet, to fix our eyes on Jesus, to look at the body on the cross, is to see God become a victim that we might be free. And that is what makes this Friday good. Amen.